It didn't happen in public. There were no cameras, no statements. No royal fanfare, just a closed-door meeting inside Windsor where King Charles III quietly made a decision that would shake the very foundation of royal influence. And when Queen Camilla emerged from that room, something was unmistakably different. The power she once carried had shifted. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed that meeting was not announced, not clarified, and certainly not explained, but it was felt, almost instantly, by those who operate within the quiet machinery of the monarchy. Reports began to suggest that something fundamental had changed in how responsibilities were being handled. Though no one dared say it outright, the absence of an official statement only deepened the intrigue. Because in a system where even the smallest adjustment is carefully framed for public consumption, silence carries its own unmistakable weight. Those closest to palace operations noticed it first. Schedules once tightly structured around Camilla's charitable appearances began to shift in subtle but telling ways, as F pieces were being quietly removed from a board no one else could see. Aides were reportedly called in with unusual urgency, conversations held behind closed doors, instructions delivered with a level of precision that left no room for interpretation. And yet, outwardly, everything remained composed, calm, even. That contrast between what was visible and what was unfolding beneath the surface only intensified the sense that something far more significant was taking place. Insiders would later whisper that the earliest signs were not found in documents or announcements, but in demeanor. The way Camilla carried herself after that meeting, the measured restraint, the absence of her usual ease, it was enough to spark quiet speculation among those trained to notice even the smallest shifts in royal behavior. And then came the first murmurs, carefully passed between trusted voices, hinting at something described only as patronage restructuring. It was a phrase that sounded administrative, almost routine, but in the context of royal hierarchy, it carried implications that were anything but ordinary. Because patronages are not merely ceremonial titles, they are extensions of influence, networks of connection, and markers of standing within the institution itself. To adjust them is to adjust power. And as those whispers began to circulate more widely, one unsettling realization started to take hold. This had not been a mutual recalibration, nor a gradual evolution. It had been a decision. A deliberate, controlled, and deeply consequential decision made in private, but already reshaping the structure of authority in ways that could not be easily reversed. And while the palace maintained its silence, that silence began to speak louder than any announcement ever could, leaving observers to piece together the fragments of a story that was still unfolding. But this wasn't just a quiet adjustment of duties, it was the unraveling of a carefully built network of influence years in the making. For years, royal patronages weren't just ceremonial titles, they were power, influence, access, and for Queen Camilla, they had become something more. A carefully constructed network that extended far beyond public charity into the deeper machinery of royal relevance. But what happens when that network is suddenly stripped away? To understand the weight of that question, you have to understand what patronages truly represent within the monarchy. They are not simply symbolic affiliations or polite gestures of support, they are strategic positions, carefully assigned and deeply embedded within the structure of public trust. Each one carries with it a relationship, a voice, and a degree of influence that extends far beyond the organization itself. And over time, those connections begin to form something larger, something that quietly shapes perception, loyalty, and even internal standing within the royal institution. For Camilla, this network did not appear overnight. It was built gradually, piece by piece, through years of careful positioning, quiet alignment, and consistent visibility. Certain organizations, particularly those tied to social welfare, literacy, and health, became closely associated with her name, reinforcing an image that was both compassionate and authoritative. But beneath that public-facing role, there was always a deeper layer, one that insiders now suggest was far more strategic than it appeared. Because patronages, when held in sufficient number and significance, create a form of soft power that is difficult to challenge and even harder to dismantle. NTLE. They offer access to influential circles, shape narratives in subtle ways, and establish a presence that extends into multiple sectors of society. And as Camilla's portfolio expanded, so too did the perception that her influence within the institution was growing in ways that were not entirely visible to the outside world. It is in this context that recent reports have taken on greater significance. Whispers from within palace circles have hinted that concerns were quietly raised by senior figures, not necessarily about the existence of these patronages, but about their concentration, their direction, and the level of control they represented. There was, according to those familiar with the situation, a growing sense that something needed to be rebalanced, though no one could say exactly how or when that shift would occur. At the same time, scrutiny began to intensify, both internally and externally. Questions were being asked carefully, discreetly about how these roles were allocated, how decisions were being made, and whether the existing structure still reflected the broader priorities of the monarchy. None of this was public, of course. It rarely is. But within an institution, where even the smallest imbalance can carry long-term consequences, these questions mattered. And they lingered, unresolved, building quietly beneath the surface. Because the reality is, power within the royal family is rarely taken. It is adjusted, redefined, and when necessary, reclaimed. And when that process begins, it does not announce itself. It unfolds slowly, deliberately, until the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. And it was that very control quietly expanding behind palace walls that may have triggered a response no one saw coming. Long before the Windsor meeting, something had been building. Subtle at first missed signals, reshuffled appearances, carefully worded briefings. But insiders now suggest the tension between King Charles III and Queen Camilla had been quietly escalating for months. The question is, what pushed it over the edge? It didn't begin with confrontation. It never does in an institution built on restraint and tradition. Instead, it unfolded in fragments, small moments that, on their own, seemed insignificant, but together began to form a pattern that could no longer be ignored. There were shifts in visibility, subtle recalibrations in who are we there, and a growing sense that roles once clearly defined were starting to blur. Reports began to circulate, carefully and quietly, suggesting that overlapping authority in certain charitable engagements had created a kind of internal friction. Nothing explosive, nothing openly acknowledged, but enough to unsettle the delicate balance that governs royal operations. For aides working behind the scenes, the strain became increasingly difficult to manage. Conflicting directives, they say, started to emerge, decisions that required interpretation rather than instruction, leaving those responsible for execution navigating a landscape that no longer felt entirely stable. And in a system where clarity is everything, even a hint of uncertainty can ripple outward in unpredictable ways. It was during this period that concerns reportedly began to surface among senior members of the royal family. Not publicly, of course, and not in any way that would invite scrutiny. But behind closed doors, in conversations shielded from view, questions were being asked. About structure, about boundaries, about whether the existing arrangement was still serving the long-term stability of the monarchy. These were not accusations, they were considerations. But in an institution defined by hierarchy and precision, even considerations carry weight. Meanwhile, the public began to notice something else, something less tangible, but no less telling. Appearances that once conveyed unity began to feel more measured, more distant. The ease that had once defined certain interactions seemed replaced by a careful neutrality, as if every gesture, every presence, was being quietly evaluated. Media outlets, always alert to even the slightest deviation, started to pick up on these shifts. Speculation grew, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, as patterns became harder to dismiss. Yet for all the attention, for all the analysis, the true nature of what was unfolding remained just out of reach, because the most important developments were not happening in public view. They were taking place elsewhere, in documents, in decisions, in conversations that would never be recorded in headlines. And as those unseen elements began to align, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. Something was coming. Not a scandal, not a dramatic rupture, but a moment of quiet consequence that would redefine the balance that had been slowly shifting for months. And when that moment finally arrived, it would not be announced, it would be felt. But the real turning point wasn't public. It was buried in documents and decisions that never reached the press. When King Charles III finally acted, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The decision was written, formal, and absolute, and according to those familiar with the process. It effectively relieved Queen Camilla of several key charity roles in one decisive move. A quiet command with loud consequences. What makes this moment so striking is not the action itself, but the way it was executed: precise, contained, and almost invisible to the outside world. There were no dramatic announcements, no public acknowledgments of change. Instead, the shift was embedded within internal structures, communicated through documents that, while rarely seen, carry undeniable authority. Reports now suggest that these documents outlined a clear and deliberate restructuring, mapping out not just what would be removed, but where those responsibilities would go next. And that is where the deeper meaning begins to surface. Because the redistribution of Patronages is never random. Each reassignment reflects intention, direction, and a broader vision of how influence should be organized within the monarchy. In this case, insiders describe the process as highly strategic, almost surgical in its precision. Roles once closely associated with Camilla were quietly transferred to other senior figures, individuals whose positions within the royal framework already aligned with the evolving priorities of the institution. The speed at which some of these transitions reportedly took place only added to the sense that this had been carefully planned in advance. Not a reaction, but a resolution. Publicly, however, the narrative remained measured, even understated. The palace, maintaining its characteristic composure, framed the developments as part of an effort to streamline duties, a phrase that, on the surface, suggests efficiency rather than upheaval. But beneath that language lies a more complex reality. Because when duties are streamlined at this level, what is truly being adjusted is not workload, but the weight of influence, of presence, of authority. And those who understand the inner workings of the monarchy recognize that such adjustments are rarely neutral. They reshape the internal landscape, often in ways that are only fully understood over time. It is this quiet recalibration that insiders continue to point to, describing the moment not as a simple administrative change, but as a redefinition of balance. A shift in where power resides and how it is expressed. And perhaps most telling of all is the absence of resistance, at least in any visible form. Because in an institution built on continuity, the most profound changes are often those that unfold without disruption, accepted not because they are easy, but because they are inevitable. And as these roles began to move, as responsibilities were absorbed and redistributed, a new structure began to take shape, one that reflects not just the present, but the direction in which the monarchy is quietly moving. And as those roles began to shift hands, a new balance inside the royal family started to emerge. The moment those patronages moved, the ripple was immediate. Names changed, roles shifted. And suddenly, figures like William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, appeared more central than ever. This wasn't just redistribution, it felt like a re-earing of the future. What had once been a carefully balanced structure now seemed to be aligning in a new direction, one that placed increasing emphasis on continuity through the next generation. And the shift was not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Patronages that had long been associated with Queen Camilla began to surface under different names, quietly reassigned to individuals whose roles within the monarchy were already evolving. For William and Catherine, this transition carried a deeper significance. It was not simply about taking on additional responsibilities, it was about stepping into a space that had been deliberately cleared, a space that now required presence, stability, and a forward-facing sense of purpose. Reports suggest that these changes were not random, nor were they temporary adjustments. They reflected a broader intention to strengthen what insiders often refer to as the core working. Royals, a group whose visibility and consistency are seen as essential to maintaining public trust. As these roles shifted, other senior members of the royal family also began to move into positions that supported this emerging structure, reinforcing a sense of cohesion that had until recently felt uncertain. Public perception, as it so often does, followed these changes with quiet attentiveness. Without needing explicit explanation, the narrative began to form one of renewal, of transition, of a monarchy adapting to the demands of a new era. Media coverage, cautious at first, gradually leaned into this interpretation, framing the developments as a form of modernization rather than disruption. It was a subtle but important distinction, one that allowed the institution to maintain its image of continuity while still acknowledging the reality of change. And yet, beneath that carefully managed perception, there remained a more complex truth. Because every shift forward inevitably casts a shadow backward. As William and Catherine's presence grew more defined, as their roles expanded and their influence became more visible, the contrast with Camilla's position became harder to overlook. Her reduced visibility was not announced, not highlighted, but it was felt through absence, through silence, through the quiet reallocation of responsibilities that once formed a significant part of her public identity. For those observing closely, it raised questions too. Hat lingered just beneath the surface. Not about conflict necessarily, but about consequence. About what is gained when power is redistributed, and what is lost in the process. Because within the monarchy, progress and sacrifice often move together, inseparable, each shaping the other in ways that are rarely acknowledged openly. And as this new structure continued to settle into place, as roles became clearer and expectations more defined, one thing became increasingly evident: the institution was moving forward, deliberately, and with purpose. But while the institution moved forward, the personal impact of that decision could not be ignored. There were no statements, no interviews, no visible confrontation. But those watching closely say Queen Camilla didn't need words to show what this meant. The silence itself became the story, and within it, a shift that couldn't be undone. In a world where every gesture is measured and every appearance carries meaning, absence speaks louder than any declaration ever could. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, that absence began to take shape. Engagements that once formed a consistent part of her public presence seemed to fade from the and are replaced not with explanation, but with quiet omission. There were no abrupt cancellations, no dramatic withdrawals, just a pattern of non-appearance that those paying attention could not ignore. It was as if the rhythm of her role had been altered, not publicly, but fundamentally. And with that change came something more difficult to define. A shift in demeanor, subtle yet unmistakable, reflected in moments where composure remained intact, but the ease that once accompanied it seemed restrained, carefully managed, almost distant. Those familiar with the pressures of royal life suggest that such changes rarely occur in isolation. They are often the result of internal recalibration, of adjustments made behind closed doors that ripple outward in ways that cannot be entirely concealed. Reports have since hinted at private disappointment, though never confirmed, never spoken aloud. Because within the monarchy, emotion is rarely displayed, it is absorbed, contained, and, when necessary, transformed into quiet resilience. Yet even in that restraint, something was being communicated. Not defiance, not resistance, but a recognition that the structure around her had shifted in a way that it could not be reversed. At the same time, the palace maintained its characteristic control over the narrative. Communication remained precise, limited, and carefully framed, offering no insight into the deeper implications of what was unfolding. This silence was not accidental, it was deliberate, a way of preserving stability while allowing change to take place without disruption. And yet, in that controlled environment, speculation found its way through. Questions began to circulate, not just about the present, but about the future. What role would Camilla now occupy within this evolving framework? How would her position adapt to the new balance that was quietly taking shape? These were not questions that demanded immediate answers, but they lingered nonetheless, shaping perception in subtle but lasting ways. And as time passed, the divide between public image and internal reality became more pronounced. Outwardly, the monarchy remained unified, composed, steady. But beneath that surface, the adjustments continued, redefining roles, redistributing influence, and reshaping the structure that had once seemed firmly established. It is in this contrast between what is shown and what I.S. felt that the true impact of these changes becomes clear, because within the royal family, transformation rarely announces itself. It unfolds in silence, in absence, in the spaces where something once existed and no longer does. And for those who understand that language, the message was unmistakable. Yet this wasn't just about one individual, it was about the survival and direction of the monarchy itself. In the end, this wasn't about conflict, it was about control. About ensuring that the monarchy under King Charles III remained focused, unified, and prepared for what comes next. And sometimes, that means making decisions that reshape even the closest alliances. What has unfolded in the wake of those quiet changes is not a story of confrontation, but of consolidation, an effort to bring clarity to a system that had begun to stretch in too many directions at once. Because within the monarchy, strength is not measured by how much power exists, but by how precisely it is organized. And as responsibilities were reassigned and roles redefined, a clearer structure began to emerge, one that reflects a deliberate move toward efficiency and cohesion. This was not simply about reducing overall overlap, it was about eliminating ambiguity, ensuring that every role carried a distinct purpose aligned with the broader vision of the institution. At the center of this recalibration is a growing emphasis on public trust, a recognition that the monarchy's relevance depends not only on tradition, but also on the trust of the people, but on its ability to operate with consistency and clarity in a rapidly changing world. And that requires focus. It requires discipline. It requires a willingness to make difficult decisions in pursuit of long-term stability. Reports suggest that this shift is closely tied to succession planning, not in the immediate sense, but as part of a larger strategy to prepare the institution for the future. By strengthening the roles of key figures, particularly those who represent continuity across generations, the monarchy positions itself to navigate transition without disruption. Figures like William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, are increasingly central within this framework, not because of sudden elevation, but because of a steady alignment between their responsibilities and the direction in which the institution is moving. This alignment is intentional, carefully managed, and deeply rooted in the understanding that stability must be built long before it is needed. At the same time, the reduction of overlapping roles serves another purpose: it minimizes the potential for internal friction, creating a more streamlined environment where authority is clearly defined and consistently applied. In a system where even small tensions can carry significant consequences, this clarity is essential. It allows the monarchy to function not as a collection of individual roles, but as a cohesive entity, unified in purpose and direction. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforces the idea that the institution itself stands above any one individual, no matter how prominent their position may have once been. Because in the end, the monarchy endures not through continuity alone, but through its ability to adapt without losing its core identity. And what we are witnessing now is not a break from tradition, but a refinement of it, a careful reshaping designed to ensure that the structure remains strong, resilient, and capable of meeting the demands of the future. But even as the structure stabilizes, the question remains: what does this mean for the future of royal power? What had happened inside Windsor wasn't just a meeting, it was a turning point. A moment where authority was quietly redefined, and the future of the monarchy took a decisive step forward. Because in the House of Windsor, power is never lost loudly, it shifts in silence. And this time, everyone felt it. The consequences of that single decision did not unfold all at once. They revealed themselves gradually, like a pattern coming into focus after months of uncertainty. What once seemed like isolated adjustments, subtle changes in roles, quiet absences, carefully managed appearances, now forms a coherent picture of transformation. At the center of that transformation stands King Charles III, not as a passive observer, but as the figure who ultimately defines the direction of the institution. His decision, delivered without spectacle, reaffirmed a truth that had never disappeared but had perhaps grown less visible over time, that authority within the monarchy rests with the sovereign, and when exercised, it reshapes everything around it. For Queen Camilla, the implications of that shift are still unfolding. Her position has not vanished, nor has it been publicly diminished in any overt sense, but it has evolved. The network of influence that once defined her presence has been altered, its reach adjusted, its weight redistributed. What remains is a role that is still significant, but more contained, more aligned with the structure that is now taking precedence. And that structure is increasingly centered around the next generation. Figures like William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, are no longer simply the future, they are becoming the present, stepping into responsibilities that position them at the heart of the monarchy's public and internal identity. This is not a sudden rise, but a deliberate transition, one that reflects careful planning and a clear understanding of what lies ahead. The long-term implications of this shift extend beyond individual roles. They point to a broader recalibration of how the monarchy functions, how authority is distributed, and how continuity is maintained in a world that demands both tradition and adaptability. It is a balance that cannot be achieved without change, and yet change within such an institution must always appear measured, controlled, almost invisible. That is the paradox at the heart of what has taken place. A profound transformation that presents itself as stability. Because outwardly, the monarchy remains what it has always been: composed, unified, enduring. But beneath that surface, the structure has been refined, strengthened, and in some ways, redefined. And perhaps that is the most revealing aspect of all. That the greatest shifts do not announce themselves with disruption, but with quiet certainty. That power, when it moves, does so not with noise, but with precision. And that within the House of Windsor, the future is not something that arrives suddenly, it is something that is carefully, deliberately shaped, one decision at a time, often behind closed doors, often without a single word spoken. And as the dust settles, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: the monarchy endures, but never without transformation. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.